Shwmai a croeso cynnes, and welcome to the What's Your Story podcast. I'm James Owen, a Welsh filmmaker and storyteller, and I'm passionate about sharing stories. This podcast is all about business owners sharing their journey, and we'll be speaking with directors, entrepreneurs and creatives from all across Wales to learn from their experiences. We believe everyone has a story to tell. What's your story? Shwmai a croeso cynnes, welcome to the next episode of What's Your Story, and today we're going to hear somebody's personal story in the world of construction. Today from very far away, it's only the Gower. He didn't take very far to come here, but today in the studio we have a structural engineer who's going to talk all things construction. Well, Lloyd, fantastic to see you come down and share your story with us. Diolch am dod.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sorry, this is in English, it's not in Welsh.
Yeah, no, I reckon I could squeeze out a whole one in Welsh if I really had to, but yeah, let's stick to English for now.
Should we do half the episode in Welsh?
Oh, I think it's the technical terms that catch me out.
Termau technegol.
Yeah, termau technegol. Yeah.
Sometimes when you hear like Welsh words, when they've made a word for a term, it's just like, what? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I know.
They don't do a good job of that, these
Not
universities,
always.
whoever picks it. So for those who are listening and watching, can you just share in a couple of sentences, what is it that you, Lloyd, do in your business as Spark Structures?
So essentially, I'm a structural engineer. I run my own business, Spark Structures, and I guess one of the initial things to just get across to people is what a structural engineer does, because I think I get a lot of questions now and again. Some people seem to know, some people don't. So essentially, I design structures, which sounds quite obvious, but I design structures. The majority of these are building structures. So if you think the buildings that you live in, that you work in, things like that. But it can be other structures like bridges. It can be school buildings. It can be, and then you can branch off into other types of engineering as well. But fundamentally, I design building structures.
And is any day the same?
No, it's fairly varied. Like the way I sort of sum it up to a lot of people is that I need to make sure that buildings are safe and stable. So they need to be able to stand up, which means they need to support the loads that are acting on them, whether that's people, whether it's equipment, wind or snow. So they have to be safe and stable. They have to be buildable. So there's no point designing something that can't be built. So you need to think about how all the components go together, how they might come to site, what materials is it made out of, what the connections are. So safe and stable, buildable. And then the sort of last one, and potentially the most important, is are they sustainable? Or is it economical? Can it be afforded? And that might mean cost and price, but it might also mean the embodied carbon and the materials and things like that.
Yeah, so I heard Lloyd speak at an event in Swansea, Design Swansea, where he shared a little bit about the story building your own home.
Yep.
And yeah, what I loved was the sort of emphasis on sustainability. We had somebody we were recording a podcast with earlier today. One of the values is sustainability. And I was sort of challenging him on, it's a buzzword in the industry, right? People want to say they're sustainable, but do they really mean it? Yeah. Because if you're applying for a tender and you've got a carbon reduction plan, okay, we're going to be sustainable. But there's a cost to sustainability, isn't there? There's a cost in terms of the most sustainable option isn't necessarily the cheapest option, is it?
No, and I think that's part of the challenge that we're having at the minute, especially, so my focus tends to be on sort of domestic scale projects. And I think sometimes when we talk about sustainability, it feels like, or the environment and climate change and things like that, it's such a big topic, which with such big statistics and figures that it's hard for people to connect with it. So what I try to do is to try and weave the sort of idea of sustainability into more sort of everyday scale projects that maybe your everyday person can sort of understand. But the challenge you get with that is that if you're struggling, I don't know, it might be cost of living, or you want to make some changes to your house, it might be that you want to build an extension or do something. It's very difficult then to always focus wholly on sustainability if if costs are mounting, and so yeah, it is a challenge. I think being sustainable can be a more costly option. So, sometimes.
I think it is a big challenge, and I've seen the sort of industry. I mean, here locally in Llanelli, right? One sort of burning issue is Ysgol Hale Goffa. So I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a school for additional learning needs, and it's one of the only, or maybe one of very, very few in the whole of the county, where people who are young people who have very severe disabilities will go there and be educated. And for years and years and years, it has been oversubscribed. The building is no longer fit for purpose. In fact, ironically, the building is even accessible. So you've got lots of kids on wheelchairs and things, and some of the building isn't accessible, which is just seems crazy. And actually, today, I think, is a year anniversary since the council told the school that they wouldn't be getting a new school. And this is something they were promised about 7 years ago, that they get a brand new school. And it was a bit of land earmarked for that development. It's just never happened. The argument is costs have soared. This school is supposedly projected costs of £37 million, right? Which is a lot of money. Now, so I've seen the sort of burning issue locally, where especially in the construction industry, it's so competitive, and people want to buy, whether it's local authority or other institutions, universities. Price wins 90% of the time. Price wins. So when it comes to being sustainable and maybe restoring a building, repurposing a building, some of the things I've seen come second. And this is in the commercial element, right? Maybe domestically, maybe you have an easier time with this sort of comparison on cost versus sustainability.
I think it sort of depends, to be honest. I think one of the big challenges that I come up against, and a lot of consultants out there do, is that you're trying to potentially convince clients to invest in you as a consultant, so to spend more money up front. And that's quite hard to do because you're asking clients to spend money before they've seen anything, before there's any shovels in the ground, before there's any bricks on site. Do you know what I mean? So you're trying to say to them, right, if you spend more money on me as your consultant, or as Spark Structures or this architect, we can do a better, more sustainable design for you. And but again, I'm battling out against other consultants, and I'm quite keen to sort of avoid that race to the bottom sort of mentality. But it is a challenge to get that across to clients, because if you're a client and you're doing an extension, you might only do one extension to your house in your lifetime. So it's not like you can do one with the cheap consultants and then one with the more expensive consultants and compare. So you're under a lot of pressure, I think, to sort of make decisions on who you're going to go with and things like that. So it can be challenging.
Yeah, that's good. I want to unpack your journey in the construction industry over these years, because you're now a business owner, fairly new business owner, not far off myself, going for a few years. But yeah, you've sort of built up a wealth of experience in the construction industry, because earlier you talked about things being stable and safe, because you could be responsible for some serious harm to people if you don't do your job right in creating or designing a structure. Sorry, have I almost put a load of weight on your shoulders, the responsibility you have?
No, not necessarily. I think there's a bit of a sort of a running debate in engineering about whether engineers and designers are properly compensated, I guess, for the level of risk that they take on. And it is quite challenging, I guess, but I suppose the way that design or current building standards and things like that are structured is that they tend to try and take a lot of the risk out of it. But that leads to a bigger discussion about what's sustainable and what's not, because in building design, if I have to calculate the loads on a building, for example, there's a 50% additional put on there as your load factor. And then that's for your sort of variable loads like wind and snow and people and things like that. And so sometimes there's this balance. You're trying to strike a balance between being risk averse but being sustainable as well. Because if you err on the side of caution too much and you say, "Oh, I'll just make that beam a little bit deeper, or make that column a little bit wider," then you're also not being sustainable, but you're trying to be extra safe. So there's a real sort of to and fro in there as well. So it can be quite a challenging thing. I think also, as an engineer, you just get into the mindset. It's not always the best mindset to be in, but I always think of it as I've got to try and think of every single way that something could go wrong. And I'm not sure how that's managed to not make me a massive pessimist. But in my professional life, I have to look at a building and think, how could that fall down? Or how could it not go together? Or how might it not be able to get to site because this piece is too big? Or and the other challenge is scale, right? So I might end up working on the design of a single screw in a connection, or I might end up working on the global stability of a multi-story building, but you're still trying to consider the same level of sort of input, the same level of design, the same level of risk, but over vast scales as well. But I think that's what I quite like. That's what keeps it quite varied. So, earlier you said, is every day the same? I suppose, well, no, it's sort of constantly changing depending on what project you're working on, what type of project that is. And then also within a project, which element are you looking at? Are you designing the individual connection, or are you looking at the global stability? And so I think it's good, it's varied, and I really enjoy it like that.
Fascinating. And you growing up, did you have this sort of aspiration that you wanted to go into structural engineering or the construction industry? What was it like before you sort of had that experience of being in the construction industry? Is this something you wanted to always do as a child?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you ask my mum, she would say that she knew it ever since. I used to love going to the beach and
build sandcastles.
Not even sandcastles. I loved a beach with a river on it or a stream, like down at Three Cliffs or something like that.
Yeah,
and where you can channel the water. So I'd be constantly digging dams all day. Digging dams and channeling water. And I think my mum would say that's when she knew that I was going to be some sort of structural engineer or civil engineer. But I think for me was that, I'm not going to lie, I was a bit of a nerd in school. I liked maths, I liked science. I liked working out how things go together, how do they come apart, how I guess that's the early stages of design, isn't it? That in some respects. But I also quite like drawing. I wouldn't say I was arty, but just quite like figuring things out on paper and stuff like that. And that seemed to just lead itself quite naturally into doing a civil engineering degree. Is what I did.
Yeah, it's good, and yeah, you graduate there, which gives you that credibility and validity. Because I think if you're then creating and designing something that people are going to live or work in, is that something that, I mean, have you maybe seen in the industry where people don't have that credibility and still build things? Or is it regulated in such a way where you have to have a degree to be able to design a set building? How does that work?
So it's fairly regulated in that you can enter into engineering through a sort of less traditional route of getting a degree. And you can have sort of college qualifications and then go through and do it that way. But the vast majority of engineers would have done a degree, and normally a master's degree in some type of engineering. So I did civil engineering, which it covers more broad things than just structures. So structural engineering is part of that. You end up learning about material science, geotechnical engineering, because ultimately every building has to sit on the ground, and so you need to know what's happening in the ground. I also learned about different aspects of infrastructure, so it was bridges and harbours and things like that, and then also things like sustainability and things like that came into it as well, and internal environment of buildings. And then what normally happens is so many years after you've graduated, when you feel like you've got enough experience, you apply to a professional body to become chartered. So either with the Institute of Structural Engineers, or because I spent a period of time in Australia, I'm actually chartered with the Institute of Engineers Australia.
Your fiancée?
Yeah, I chased my fiancée to Australia and became a chartered engineer out there.
So you are a chartered structural engineer?
Chartered structural engineer.
Whoa,
yeah.
that sounds good. Chartered.
Yeah, it means I can put a few extra letters after my name.
On your LinkedIn.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, brilliant. And so are you were chartered in Australia?
Technically, yes.
Yeah.
But that,
Do you have a chartered status in the UK now? Does that differ?
I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't done the chartership with the Institute of Structural Engineers, which is the British one.
I dropped you in it.
A little bit, because I've sort of been putting it off because it involves like an 8-hour exam or something like that.
Got to do it now, Lloyd.
I know. I know. Now I said it live on the podcast. I have to just.
I'll hold you accountable.
It's in terms of how sort of tricky it is, particularly with the Institute of Structural Engineers one. That day-long exam is meant to really test you as an engineer. You're sort of thinking on the feet and things like that.
You got this, mate.
So
you know
right,
it.
Yeah.
You're chartered in Australia, so you know your stuff. Based on that, we were talking about. I've heard of some of these terms: structural engineer, structural surveyor, civil engineering. They all seem sort of, to me, operate in the same sort of space. But what are maybe some of those different roles I've shared there? Civil engineer, structural surveyor. How might they differ? What are the sort of different roles? Because I mean, there's architects. I think that's a whole other story. Maybe later we can unpack and compare that.
Yeah. So the main thing. Well, I'll start off the one that I sort of can talk about more confidently, and that would be being a structural engineer. So, like I mentioned earlier, your role there is designing the actual structure. So think of it as like designing the nuts and bolts.
That could be timber. It could be in terms
steel.
Of
materials, we could talk about the main ones that I would design in is steel, timber, concrete, masonry. So that could cover brickwork, blockwork, stonework. And then you can start to branch off into other sort of types of metals, aluminium, stainless steel. It might be composites and things like that. So that's fairly varied, but my focus is on sort of structures, particularly building structures, so how they all go together. So I tend to work with a lot of architects and artists and people like that, people who come to me with, I've got this building or this idea for a building. Can you work with me to make it work? Civil engineers, on the other hand, is almost an even broader term than structural engineers, but they tend to be more focused on larger infrastructure, or not necessarily larger, but infrastructure projects. So think drainage, think dams, potentially bridges, harbours, things where you're sort of more up against the sort of forces of nature, I'd say, and things like that.
Okay.
And then building surveyors, that's almost like a whole other. You might have to have a separate podcast with a surveyor talk about that, because that opens up into all other avenues then as well. But they generally, a sort of surveyor is either going to be doing sort of measured surveys, is when you'd get somebody out to actually plot out the dimensions of your building or your site and look at the topography. So that's when you get a measured survey done. Or say you were buying a house and you get a surveyor to come in and look at the house, then they're coming at it from more of an assessing. They'll assess the existing structure or the existing building that's there. But you'll normally find a point that they get to in their report that says, or we flagged something up here, or there's some cracks in this wall, you might want to consult the structural engineer. And that's where
you come in.
That's where I come in, potentially, yeah.
Great. Have you ever had any arguments with architects in your time?
I wouldn't say arguments. That's a good question, though.
Screamers?
I think the way in an ideal world, you'd sort of work, it'd all be seamless, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But it never really is. And I think, if I'm being honest, that would be the one. I wouldn't call it the downside of being an engineer, but you become known potentially as the no person, the person that's saying no.
I can see why.
Yeah.
Because this architect might design this fantastic house.
Yeah.
It's going to look like this. And then you go, yeah, you can't do that.
Yeah. Which is, I hate to sound cheesy, but my attitude is, well, let's try and figure out how we can do it, how we can get as close as possible to it. Like, there's this sort of cliched thing that architects will say, engineers will joke that architects say, well, I want it to look like it's floating. Or I want these things to be as thin as possible.
Impossible structures. I want to hang
it from the sky. So I think it's good to be pushed, though. Yeah. I think it's good to be pushed. It'd be easy to just sit in your comfort zone all day long and just plonk columns in wherever they need to be. I think I wouldn't say it's arguments with architects, but I think it's good to be pushed by architects and other designers. Yeah.
That's a good attitude to have, because you've sort of talked about that now, isn't it, about making impossible structures. But yeah, maybe having that perception and that perspective of, okay, let's see how we can try and achieve that, because the outcome might be it's not 100% what they envisaged, but maybe it's 90% or 80%. Your job is to try and the architect almost comes in with the vision, and then you're then doing the groundwork and the more practical elements of, well, how can this actually function, and how can we make this a reality, or as close to reality if it's unbelievably impossible based on a floating house, let's say. So but it goes to show that you're one part of that cog. And if you're bringing together a development, whether that's residential, commercial, you've got to work with architects. You've got to maybe work with a surveyor who's going to do the groundwork surveying, civils. So it's all part of people coming together to make that development a reality and a success. Because at the end of the day, that's what we want, is a success. Because I've heard of projects across the UK where you've had full-blown commercial developments built, and then all of a sudden it's failed planning, or structurally it's not safe, and they've gone too far. It's just made a mess, because then you've got a building that's not safe or not developed. And surely if you did the structural work properly, then maybe you wouldn't got to that sort of point. And I've seen that. I've seen instances where you've got full developments, and across the world I've sort of seen it, skyscrapers that are abandoned because something's happened down the line that wasn't really thought through. So it's important that you work as a team with lots of various people. It's clear that you love what you do. What have been some of your highlights in your sort of career? Have you maybe developed some significant structures or fun projects? Maybe a famous person's house? What have been some of your highlights?
I think there's a couple of highlights. I think the projects that tend to really stand out for me, obviously I enjoy doing sort of new build houses and refurbs and things like that. But there's always been a sort of chunk of my work that's been quite different, and that's been working on sort of art installations and sculptures and things like that. Particularly early in my career, when I worked for a company in London called Structure Workshop, and I still sort of keep in touch with my old director Pete, and I think some of my highlights were when I was quite a young sort of graduate engineer, and being given the opportunity to work on quite large scale art projects while I was there. And I think that's always stuck with me. So I worked, there's an artist called Conrad Shawcross, who's based in London. And while I was at Structure Workshop, I got to be part of the team that designed a really amazing piece called Dappled Light of the Sun, that he was commissioned to produce for the courtyard at the Royal Academy. So the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition has in the Atterberg courtyard, I think that's what it's called. They have a piece that's in the courtyard every summer. And so I sort of worked on that while I was at Structure Workshop, and that was a bit of a highlight. And it was partly because when I tend to work on those art projects, my role sort of expands slightly beyond just being a structural engineer, because I end up sometimes working on the concept side of it with the artist. So the artist will come with a scribble and an idea, and you sort of work on the 3D modeling or the sketches, and you sort of back and forth with the artist, which feels really good. And then we sort of transferred that over into doing the structural analysis and the structural design to make sure this whole thing could go together, because it was made up of these Corten, these weathering steel tetrahedrons that all bolted together and sort of went out in this sort of growth pattern. So it sort of looked a bit like a tree. And so the challenge there was not only designing it, making sure it stood up, making sure the artist was happy with it. We then had to find a way to communicate to the people that were putting it together, fabricating it, how to put together this mad thing, this really complex geometry. And then we stood it up on tripods so that people could walk underneath it. Wow. And so that was probably one of my highlights. And it's from really quite early on, when I was quite not inexperienced, but when I was just starting out, and it sort of stuck with me ever since.
Before you were chartered?
Yeah, a long time before I was chartered. And then I think more recently would be a project. I think you might have seen a clip of it actually at Design Swansea while I was at Format Engineers in Bath. I worked on a project called the Sinking House project.
Yeah, I've seen that.
So that was for COP26, which is the climate conference, and we worked with a local, I say a local architect. They're a national architect with Stride Treglawn. They've got offices in Bath and they've got offices in Bristol, and they had this idea that this concept of a house that was partially submerged in the River Avon that looked like it was just about to drop over the weir at Bath, like in that really famous spot just below Pulteney Bridge. And so it was while I was working at Format, it's sort of a bit different to my everyday sort of work, but it was figuring out how we're going to build this sort of timber framed structure on a floating pontoon. How are we going to get it into the river? What are we going to attach it to? How's it going to stand up? And then what I did was I took a week off work as an engineer and joined my friend Sam, who's a carpenter, because he'd been brought in. They needed somebody to do the build. And now Sam, who has his own company, FM Create or FM Carpentry, his background is more in, he does your sort of average, sort of everyday carpentry, but he also does festival builds. And so the good thing about the guys that do festival builds is that they've really got this can-do sort of attitude. So when I said to him, right, we want to build this thing that looks like a big red sinking house, but we need to somehow float it in the river and then get it down to this. And he was like, yeah, I think we can do that. I think we can work it out. So me and him sort of our heads together, and along with a whole team of a real motley crew of people managed to get that to work. And it was a really amazing moment, because what happened was we built it on the dry land. The Bath Sea Cadets lent us the outside yard of their sort of this sort of place they've got in Bath that's right on the river, and they lent us their floating pontoon. They were so accommodating. They let us take the fence out along where their place, their backyard goes onto the river, and we built it on rollers. So it was like Egyptian style, we called it. So we built it on rollers, and we built a ramp for it. So we rolled this big red house that's on a bit of a wonk. After we'd built it, we sort of rolled it out onto this ramp, and it tipped, and then we lowered it down into the river. And then Sam found one of his mates that was happy to sort of tow it into position and stuff like that. So it was a mission. A real mission. And I think that one actually won an award. I think it was a collaboration award. I can't remember who the award was with, but I thought that was quite a nice way of sort of summing it up, just because there were so many. You talked about people working together to make a project happen. I think that's why that one's a highlight, was that there was just so many parties involved. And then there was also a local artist as well. I'm trying to remember everybody so I can sort of name check them. I think it was Anna Gillespie designed a figure to go on top of the sinking house that looked like it was holding a rope that was attached to the bridge. So
yeah, I remember you sharing that. And that's where me and my wife got engaged. I proposed to her across the way.
Did you really?
By the yeah.
Oh, it's a lovely spot, that is.
It's a lovely spot. I mean, the plan was I was going to do it in the Roman baths, but I chickened out.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I was like, it was like 5 o'clock. The sun was setting. Yeah, is there anywhere else you want to go, Cariad? And she was fuming with me because I went missing for 20 minutes in the Roman baths.
Oh, right.
I left it alone. And I was just like on my phone, messaging my mates. I haven't done it yet. I can't do it. I'm nervous. And in the end, it was just kind of like, she was like, I just want to go home. I've had enough now. Let's go this way. We'll go the scenic route. And I didn't plan it. I just picked it, and then did my speech. Speech. And as I proposed, my fiance at the time, Amy, she had an argument with me. Because the start of my speech was, we've been together for 9 months now, and and she's like, no, we haven't. Yes, we have. No, we haven't. It's like, blink your heck, I'm an argument. I'm trying to propose you, and we're having a flipping argument. But Bath, love that place.
Yeah, it's a lovely city.
It's a great city.
I think you'd have been all right. There'd have been plenty of nice places you could have, as long as you didn't run out of time and had to do it in the service station on the way home or something like that.
Definitely not. It was a nice place. And, for me as a filmmaker, storyteller, I had this amazing plan of putting a camera that's like capturing the moment, because I wanted to do it. But, I missed that opportunity. But what I love about it is, like, it's our moment that we shared, very, very personal. and everyone has this sort of idea of posting things on social media and their highlights and all that. But for us, in the moment, it was very, very, very special. But Bath, great place.
Don't worry, I didn't get a video of my proposal either. I think sometimes there's a bit of pressure to record everything. I know this probably goes against everything you believe in as a storyteller and a filmmaker, but I think almost it makes that moment more special when you can when it's just yours.
Yeah, you've lived it, and it's only that experience is something you can share, nobody else, which is I think makes it special, doesn't it? Yeah. Anyway, you were in Bath fitting a art sculpture. That's how we got onto that. I'd love you to talk through some of your statistics. I know you got your book and you've done some lots of studying and notes, but maybe some facts about the sustainability element of construction, because you've built your own house.
I have, yeah.
Well, I think you paid some people to build the house, but you were sort of very involved in the design.
Yes.
Maybe talk through some of the statistics that exist when it comes to CO2 emissions and sustainability in creating or repurposing developments.
Yeah, I'd love to. I can talk about this. You're
going to nerd out.
I'd nerd out a little bit, but I think the reason I was sort of motivated originally to do that talk at Design Swansea is that I think a lot of people, I think the way that they sort of aim their energies in terms of doing building design and building structures can be sort of reallocated a little bit. Let me just sort of explain that a little bit better. In that, essentially, when you've got a building, in terms of its embodied carbon, which is the emissions that building produces, it's split into two parts. And you've got one is your operational carbon or your operational emissions, and the other one is your embodied carbon. And your operational stuff is quite straightforward in that it's the emissions that building produces in its day-to-day use. And I think people can wrap their heads around that because that comes from things like heating, cooling, and just general lights, electricity, anything like that you're using in your building. And now that's, to a certain extent, that's been taken out of our hands because if you're getting your electricity from the grid, the government has made a commitment to decarbonize the grid by 2030. So that's great because that takes that element out of our hands to a certain extent. I think we can still use less and be more conscious of it. But the operational carbon as well is something that's been dealt with over the years through making more efficient buildings in terms of their thermal envelope, in terms of air tightness. That's what building regulations and stuff like that covers. And I think your average person on the street, they sort of understand that stuff. But the bit that I think that I'm quite passionate about getting people to engage with more is the embodied carbon. Now that, in a nutshell, is the carbon and the emissions that goes into producing the materials that your building is made out of. And that could be everything from extracting the raw materials, so chopping down a tree or extracting clay or stone or whatever from the ground. It's processing it into the product that you then ultimately use on site. It's transporting it to site and then it's putting it into position. So that's where your embodied carbon comes in. And now the reason I think it's because I know that's going to become more and more important is because buildings are becoming more and more efficient in terms of their operational carbon. The proportion of that building's embodied carbon in terms of the building's overall carbon footprint is getting bigger and bigger. So now that we're designing sort of low energy buildings, your embodied carbon could account for, traditionally it would have been about 30% of your building's carbon footprint, but now it could be upwards of 75% of your building's carbon footprint. Now, I think that's mad. Like, it's mad that it's going this way, and it hasn't really been regulated, or there's sort of limited sort of regulation and guidance on it. So I'm quite keen to sort of get that out there as an idea, particularly for domestic scale clients as well, to be like, what? Because I think sometimes with climate change, people can feel a little bit lost or a little bit overwhelmed with the big numbers. So what I'm quite keen to do is to try and bring it back to things that we understand and sort of figures that we can reference it.
Yeah, you've made some quite relatable in terms of the, were you comparing it to flights?
Yeah.
What were some of the stats on, maybe talk us through your home as an example.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got those to hand.
I have got some figures, yeah.
Yeah. I'd love to hear that.
So I think the ones that I tried to relate it back to before was that, and it's, when you're talking about this, I'm not trying to bombard you with figures, but essentially, if you drive a diesel car 10,000 miles, which I'm guilty of driving a diesel car, and I think lots of people are, then that's roughly, so 10,000 miles in a diesel car is about 2.7 tons of CO2 equivalent. So everything gets put back to an equivalent CO2, so you can compare across the board. A flight, and if you sit in economy from London to New York, I've never been from London to New York, but per passenger is 1.1 tons. Now that makes you realize how absolutely impactful flight is, flying airplanes. But that's maybe a totally other podcast, maybe not for me, for somebody who's an expert in that field. But that's 1.1 tons per passenger in economy. Obviously, if you fly business class, which I don't know, maybe you do.
I don't earn enough money to fly business class.
And it's 3 or 4 times that.
Oh my goodness.
Because there's fewer seats in there. So I tried to relate it back to these things. And then the other figure, the big headline figure, is a 1-year average. So your average person in the UK, their average carbon footprint over a year is about 13 tons, 13 tons of CO2 equivalent. And so that's just to sort of set the scene. And again, those figures don't necessarily mean much to anyone, but it's just to give us a reference point. And then you start banding about sort of statistics like the construction industry accounts for almost 50% of carbon emissions in the UK. And now my problem is with that is that it's just to get across that it's a big amount. That doesn't really necessarily mean anything, but it means I think there's a lot of potential there for us to improve on it if it's accounting for 50% of the
construction. Can manage that better. It would obviously bring that overall carbon down.
Even a small gain in construction is a massive gain overall then, isn't it? And then to relate it back to sort of building structures and things like that, your average 2-bedroom house to build has about 80 tons of CO2 equivalent. So you're already talking, what's that, 8 times, maybe 7 or 8 times your average person's annual carbon footprint. So that's when all these figures, when I started going through this and when I started equating them side by side, that's when I started to realize if you're planning a building project as a client, or better still, if you're an engineer or a designer or an architect or a developer, you've got this massive opportunity to save on the embodied carbon in your building. And that's when I had the penny drop moment. So for example, one sort of domestic, when I say domestic, I mean sort of small scale, everyday sort of house project, whether that's an extension or it's building a nice big house, that could equate to anywhere between 2 and 20 years of personal carbon footprint of the average person. And when I started to sort of put those figures alongside each other, I think that's when people start to realize, well, I do all these little things every day. And I'm not saying don't do those little things you do every day, but there's like this, maybe this untapped opportunity. And then I think what really drove it home for me is that, on average, I might do between 20 and 40 projects in a year. So if I multiply that out, 20 to 40 sort of reasonable domestic scale projects, in a year, I could be affecting anywhere between 40 and 400 years worth of personal carbon footprint on the projects that I work on. So you talked earlier about like responsibility and risk and things like that. And I think that's probably one of the bits that hit me the hardest.
Not the actual structural health and safety element of it. It's more the long-term impact that carbon has in your developments.
Exactly. And then when I multiply that out, so if I want to freak myself out even more, or motivate myself, I should say. So say I have a good 40-year career in structural engineering. If I multiply that out, I could affect anywhere between 1,600 and 16,000 years worth of personal carbon footprint in my 40-year career. So
is that like one flight to New York?
It all just extrapolates.
Full flight.
Yeah. Well, maybe. Yeah. I haven't equated that to a full flight, but probably is. Which makes you realize that the air industry's got a lot to answer for as well. But I don't mean for this to be doom and gloom. I just mean for it to be, there's these opportunities out there that we can leverage. And then I suppose like it'd be pretty useless of me not to say how we leverage those opportunities. And so when we spoke before, I sort of break it down into three simple points. Essentially, good design is the overarching theme, but the first point is how do we reduce our carbon footprint in terms of embodied carbon of buildings? Well, we try building less, and I know that might sound a bit daft and a bit obvious, but to me, and this isn't just a plug for good architects, but one of the easiest ways to build less potentially is to engage with a good architect and good consultants, because they might have the vision then to work out how you can do more with a building that you've already got, so then you don't have to build as much. And avoiding a whole building project could save the equivalent of years worth of carbon footprint. And I won't dwell on too many of them too much, but the other aspect I think of good design being good for reducing embodied carbon is reuse. So we touched on this earlier, and one of the figures that I really liked, or that I thought was quite impactful, is that 80% of the buildings that we're going to need in 2050 already exist. So if they already exist, then it's about reusing what we've already got and not necessarily just pulling it down and starting again.
Yeah.
But again, that takes investment. It takes investment from a client point of view. It takes investment in terms of having good consultants on board again. Because if sometimes it's harder and more expensive in some ways to work with what's there, because you're dealing with the unknown. So a big part of my job is playing structural detective. I have to go into a building and think, what was in the mind of the person that originally designed this building or originally built it, or what changes have happened since then? Because people do all sorts of things to buildings that you wouldn't believe when you start picking them apart. But I think that's part of it. So if we can reuse what's there. So an example of that with a project I've worked on is that it was with an architect called Group 19 Architects. And we took a single story bungalow and we put another story on top of it. Now it might have been easier in inverted commas in some ways to have knocked it down and started again, but because we reused as much as what was there that we could, we reused the foundations, we reused the ground floor walls. Then we made a saving, just a saving in terms of carbon of 1 year of personal carbon footprint worth, or 14 flights to from London to New York. But then that doesn't even take into account that you've got a double save in there, because the bits that you've reused, you haven't had to put back in, if you know what I mean. So
existing embodied carbon,
exactly. So you're locking it in even longer then. So that's great for me. So it's good design through building less, good design through reusing, and the other one, which sort of ties into the house that we've recently built, is good design through using low carbon materials. And I think the most obvious examples of that is making a switch to timber, for example, rather than brickwork and block work, or trying to minimize concrete and minimize steel. And sometimes that isn't about swapping out materials. It's about, again, I sort of sound a little bit repetitive, but if you can invest in good consultants, so good engineers and good architects, what you're doing by sort of investing in good ones is that they'll spend more time on your project. Because I hate to say it, but if you're gonna always gonna go for the lowest price, you're gonna get the person that's probably gonna spend the least amount of time on your project. So I know as an engineer, if I put in a rock bottom price, I want to make the job as easy as possible for me, not as good as possible for the client or the environment. And so that's where that's the challenge bit, is trying to convince clients that if you spend this money up front, I'll spend more time on the design. It might actually save you money in the long run, because if I'm just out to make my life easy, I'll make all the beams massive, I'll make them really long, I'll make my calculations easier, I'll make my drawings easier. I won't necessarily make the building as efficient and sustainable as possible. So just using our house as an example, we made a conscious decision to use a company based in Wales called PYC Group, who do timber frame buildings, and we saved. I think I did the calculation just for the external walls, just to sort of make things a little bit easier. But the difference in switching from your classic sort of brick and block and PIR insulation cavity wall to our timber framed one with a warm cell insulation was over a year's worth of personal carbon footprint, or 15 flights from London to New York. So, it does all add up. And I think that's what I'm quite keen to get across to people. The opportunities are there.
Yeah, and for you, you've got a bigger challenge to help fix this problem because, like you said, the weight and the responsibility of the increasing in carbon through choice of materials and things like that. You almost got to educate your clients to maybe go for the most sustainable option and as best as possible. But for people like myself, who maybe in the future I want to maybe build an extension at home, or what are maybe some of the simpler things that we can do when it comes to being conscious about developing, buying property or anything? Well, what are some of the simplest things we can do and think about to make things sustainable?
That's a good question. I think purely from the sort of structural point of view, I think if I work back through those, it would be if you can look to, so there's become this big drive over the last, I don't know how many decades, for open plan. Everything needs to be open plan. I need as few walls as possible, like less of this, less of that. And then, which is great to a certain extent. So I would say if you can sort of engage in some good design, that means that you keep a few more of your walls in, or you keep a brick pier where you would have had a big opening otherwise, and just keeping a bit of existing structure means that you don't need such a big steel frame or something like that. And so I think first thing's about being open-minded. And then it's about engaging with consultants or maybe just seeing that sometimes like less is more. So if you can just if you can keep more of the existing structure there and work with the building that you've already got, I think it's probably, and I know that's not the most practical way of saying it, but I think that's it. It's not always going against the grain, it's sort of working with what you've got.
The answer is spend more money on your structural engineer.
Well, potentially, yeah.
Great. Oh, that's some great insight into how we should be more conscious about sustainability in development of spaces, whether it's people like myself buying property, developing a space, or in the bigger world in Wales in construction industry. Because if they account for 50% of our carbon footprint and they can make a small little gain, like you said, it's a big gain across the board. And just like as we close, I'd love to ask you for those that are watching, listening, this podcast is all about telling stories, right? And we've got to hear a little bit about your story and how you're making little gains to impact the world in construction bit by bit. I'd love to hear if you could spend some time listening to somebody's story, somebody that's very influential, maybe inspired you to start your journey. That could be somebody fictional, bit of fun. Whose story would you love to hear, Lloyd?
Good question. I think I wouldn't be a very good structural engineer if I didn't name a famous structural engineer.
Of course.
I think I'd probably go for Isambard Kingdom Brunel, probably one of the most famous British engineers. Just because he made such a massive difference to Britain during the Industrial Revolution, and he did tunnels, he did bridges, he did railway stations, he did like a bit of everything. So I think he'd be a really interesting choice.
Any of your art sculptures inspired by his work?
No, not quite. But I think one of the questions a lot of engineers get asked is what their sort of favourite structure is or the favourite building is, and I've got a real soft spot for Paddington railway station in London.
Oh, it's fantastic.
And I think it just ties into that sort of idea that there is still these great structures that were built, that long ago by people like Isambard Kingdom Brunel that are still there, still beautiful, still standing. And like in a way, that's a sort of testament for sustainability in some ways. If you're building a building that can last 100, 150 years or more, then that's great.
Any job. Great, thanks for sharing that, Lloyd. Really appreciate it. And if those want to learn more about you and your business and maybe you want some advice, where's the best place for people to find out about you?
So the best place is probably on my website, which is sparkstructures.com. Or if you type that into Google, you'll find me on Instagram as well. So just, feel free to reach out.
If you need a sustainable building project, DM Lloyd here. He will sort you out. Well, diolch am dod. Thank you for coming, sharing your personal story. And great to hear bit by bit you're reducing your carbon footprint in the industry. And it's been really fascinating, interesting to hear all about your statistics and to hear about your home build project as well.
Lovely.
So diolch am dod.
Thank you very much, diolch yn fawr.